Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Light the World podcast. I'm your host, LT World. On this podcast, we just check out cultural issues and topics and try to look at their background and see what both sides say. And we also, on this podcast, interview people who are involved in the culture, like the arts or the entertainment industry, or people with interesting backgrounds and interesting background stories. Like we interviewed a guy who grew up in a cult. If stuff like that sounds interesting to you, definitely subscribe or follow on whatever podcast platform you're listening to this on. And you can also check out my Instagram and my Twitter and check me out at l2world.info. Now, jumping into today's topic. On today's episode, we are going to be looking at racism. Now on most topics, I normally do a 2 episode thing where I'll talk about the history or the background of a topic, like we did for feminism, like we did for gender theory, stuff like that. And then the next episode, I'll talk about kind of the arguments for and against these different topics. However, we're going to be covering critical race theory, or CRT, as it is colloquially known as. And I'm going to actually spend 3 episodes on this one. Now, this episode is going to be more about just the general history of racism in the West, just to give an overscope of what the roots of racism are for America specifically. And then the next episode, we're going to be looking at CRT. What's the roots and the history of CRT as an intellectual theory? And then the episode after that, we'll talk about the arguments for and against critical race theory. And I wanted to kind of give this broad overview of just general racism in America, because I think sometimes we can lose sight of what actually happened, like how bad racism was in the past and how that applies in the critical race theory. So I just think it's important for context to understand the background of racism in general and just kind of go through the history of it and just take a broad overview of what racism was like leading up to now. And then we'll talk more about critical race theory in and of itself. So this episode, I'm not sure how long it'll take. It might be a little bit long, but we're just going to be spending some time looking at racism in the West. So let's get started in 1619. Yeah, we're turning back the dial pretty far back here. And 1619 was kind of the start of slavery in the West. Now, some scholars will argue that slavery was around in the West before that there were trades or African Americans being neglected and stuff in the West before 1619. However, 1619 is the most notable landmark date for slavery because it's kind of the first one that we really have official records of that is concrete. And it starts in Jamestown. And so Jamestown was this small little, settlers village area town. And the first ship that came over with African Americans was called the White Lion. So the White Lion, which I think is just, it's aptly named considering what it did in regards to what it delivered to Jamestown in 1619. But anyway, the ship called White Lion anchored in James River and was recorded to have, according to colonist John Rolfe, 20 and odd African Americans, which the ship pirated off of a Portuguese ship. So some of the first slaves that came into the West that were specifically African American were pirated off another ship that was trading slaves across the Atlantic. So that's how the first African American slaves came to the West. And so obviously already we can see the application of slavery to race, how the two started to come together as we progressed from there. But so a lot of people already kind of know about 1619, how Jamestown had some of the first slaves come in from the White Lion. And then obviously progressing from 1619, we had a lot more stuff to follow. Another notable thing that happened was in 1662, there was a Virginia law that's passed. This is before the United States is officially its own country. This is before the Revolutionary War, obviously. This is way before that. This is just when people are settling the West. This is kind of the moment when settlements were starting to really come across the eastern coast of the America. So, 1662, there was a Virginia law that was passed that the status of the child followed the status of its mother. This was to already ingrain a sense of hierarchy between slaves and the rest of society. So if basically the law stated that if a child's mother were a slave woman, then the child is now considered chattel or considered a slave as well. And that was in order to make sure that there wasn't any arguments about human rights coming from the slaves. So a lot of times what would happen is the slaves would have children, and the children then would want to be like, well, I'm a human being, I've been born here, but then this law said, no, you're actually still property, you still belong to whoever owns the mother or whoever owns your father, stuff like that. So already we can kind of see how slavery and then racism is just being ingrained into the culture and being something that is maintained even before the United States was being established. And as this continued to go on, as the more slaves started coming all over, because after 1619, the trade continued to go on, and more slaves were getting delivered here, getting dropped off, and the slave trade was sadly thriving in the states at this point, which, well, they weren't technically states yet, but in the settlements at this point. And as things continued to progress, there would be rebellions, there would be other things that were going on, but they would always be quelched or squandered. So, for instance, in 1739, this is about 70, 80 years following the Virginia law, there was what they called the Stono Rebellion in South Carolina, one of the largest slave rebellions before the United States was developed, just outside Charleston, South Carolina. So, as we already kind of established, you have the slave trade started. You have the slave trade started in 1619, and then you have the Virginia law and other laws like that made by other settlements, establishing that if you're a slave person, you have children, those become slaves, and slaves have no human rights. They have no freedom to move within the governments that these settlements were establishing. And all these slaves, a lot of these slaves happened to be black, and therefore a lot of black people were stuck in this system. So then, and you had the Stono Rebellion in 1739, because obviously a lot of these slaves were getting frustrated. They didn't have rights. They were being mistreated. They wouldn't be getting paid. And their families, worse off, were, due to these type of laws, like the Virginia law, were subject to long-term suffering. So in 1739, Jemmy, an enslaved man, gathered a group of slaves together, and he killed 2 storekeepers that had guns and ammo at their stores, and then he proceeded to march and call out for slaves to join his revolution. And they were heading for Florida because presumably they would be free in Florida. However, as these slaves were gathering together, because, I mean, Jemmy caused a big scene, a bunch of slaves started joining him and started getting weapons and stuff like that. A bloody skirmish broke out, killing about 60 people total, 40 black people and 20 white people, and nearly 100 slaves joined the rebellion before it was quenched by militias, basically. So, following that, North Carolina suspended some of the slave trade for a little bit to basically reconstruct themselves and figure out what they're going to do down the future to prevent something like that to happen. And then they created a law in 1740 called the Negro Law, which banned black people from gathering, getting educated, and moving abroad. So again, even before the states were established, even before the Revolutionary War, we have laws in place to prevent black people from getting educated, from gathering together in large groups, and from moving or traveling across the land or territory. So again, the roots for racism were started early in this era. However, this does lead us then to the Revolutionary War, because there's a lot of people who will talk about how racism, how slavery itself should have ended at the Revolutionary War, but it didn't due to political factors, and there's some truth to that. So you had the Revolutionary War then occur in 1783. So when the USA finally gained its independence in 1783, at the final Revolutionary War, slavery became a hot topic. So in 1619, you had the first slaves that come to America that got pirated off another ship, and then the slave trade started to happen across the Atlantic, towards the States, across Europe, Africa, stuff like this. And then you have laws that are being established in these different regions, these different settlements by these different governments, making sure that black people couldn't get educated or move up, and that slaves remained to be slaves. But once we got to the Revolutionary War, slavery was a hot topic because people in the North were finding less and less reason to have slaves. People in the South, a lot of their staple of income was based on slave labor. So people in the North were building factories. They were trying to become more industrialized. They had more cities. And slavery was less important to them. They didn't necessarily need slaves to thrive economically. But in the South, they had a lot of big cotton farms, and they had a lot of big plantations. And they wanted slaves because slaves are cheap labor, and they would make them more money that way. So it became a heated topic after the Revolutionary War as of what to do about slavery. And so there was people in the North who found slavery distasteful, and they thought slavery reminded them of the British control and oppression. So there was a bunch of people after the Revolutionary War who thought slavery should end because slavery is just like what they experienced from Britain as being oppressed and being controlled by the government. However, money speaks, so people who were making money off slaves said, no, this is our right to own these slaves. They're just property anyway. They're not even recognized as humans according to our laws, so why should we start recognizing them as humans now? And the Constitution obviously reflects this dilemma because they tried to make a bunch of compromises. The most notable one is the Three-Fifth Compromise, where basically southern states or states who own slave states wanted to make it that their that black people basically and slaves would be able to vote, but yet be counted as property. And the government said, well, we can't have their vote count fully, or else you'll dictate government. And since they count as property, you really shouldn't have a voting at all. But we want to maintain unity among the states to form this government, so they made the Three-Fifths Compromise, which would later be revoked. But the Constitution reflects this dilemma that they had regarding slavery. Now, as the years progressed, slavery would keep coming up, and as anyone who knows anything about American history, Civil War will eventually come up. But as things progressed, people in the North especially didn't like slavery. They didn't need slavery, and they thought it was distasteful. They thought it was immoral for the most part. And people in the South wanted to keep fighting for it. People with slaves wanted to keep fighting for it. But eventually, there was another compromise that came in 1808, which was the international slave trade was outlawed. So the U.S. government established that you could no longer get slaves, or get black people primarily, from other countries across the Atlantic because they wanted to outlaw that. They didn't want any more imports of slaves. But they did promote domestic trading. So even though internationally you couldn't trade slaves anymore, domestically you could. So across states you would sell slaves, or your slave would have a child, you could sell that child to another plantation for money. Stuff like that. It would divide families, and it's horrible. But they would promote this domestic trade. But in 1808, you see that slavery from international trade of slavery was outlawed. As the tension continued to rise, because as the U.S. would expand now, so the U.S. started expanding west, it started expanding a little bit more even south, and you started to have these new states joining the Union, joining the United States. And the question was, well, what are these states going to become, and how much political influence will they have? Will they be free states, or will they be slave states? And as cotton grew in demand in the South, well, they needed more labor, and slave labor was cheaper than hiring U.S. citizens to work for them. And there was no obligations to slaves. They didn't have any legal rights. They weren't really recognized by courts, so there was less problems to worry about. And as these incentives then came for slave states to fight for more slave states as they expanded, and as they were incentivized economically to get slave labor. They were constantly at war then with the North, who wanted to get rid of slavery because of moral reasons, who wanted to get rid of slavery because the South could wield more economic power over the northern states by having slaves. And so the North also wanted to make free states out of the new states because they thought slavery was wrong, and also, again, they wanted to have more political power than the slave states. So there was a little bit of a morality involved. There was also politics involved. And you also had other movements like the Underground Railroad, the abolitionists, and other types of groups like that who were helping fight against the slave trade and helping slaves escape, which would cause more division between the slave states and the free states. So this is just the tension in the brewing that's going to lead up to the Civil War, and these are kind of things that are really fuming underneath, and this is how things started to happen. It is important to note, though, that during this in-between period before the Civil War, but following the Revolutionary War, that some states there was varying levels of freedom in different states. So sometimes we have this preconception in our heads that every state was just as bad as all the other states, but no, not every state was equal in regards to how they treated black people. So for instance, in New York banned slavery, banned slavery altogether in 1827, which enabled actually the Freedom's Journal to be the first newspaper owned and run by African Americans. So for instance, you had states like New York and other states in the North specifically more often that outlawed slavery, that gave black people opportunities to thrive more than they would in the South. I'm not saying there wasn't racism in the North, but that gave them a little bit more opportunity to thrive than they would be in the South. And so not every state was equal in how they treated black people either. But there was this division between the states based on slavery and racism and all those sorts of things. And then this brewing continued on, and then in 1850, we have some really big events that occur. So in 1850, Congress then passed the Fugitive Slave Act, which stated that everyone, no matter their view on slavery, must help capture and return runaway slaves. So slave states, like in the South and stuff, were demanding the federal government to fight for them, for their slavery, basically saying, yeah, you might not agree with slavery is right, but our slaves are still belong to us. They're still our property, even though they're human beings. And if you find a slave that ran away from our property, you actually need to report it and return it to us, because they were losing money for every runaway slave. And since there's places like Underground Railroad and things like that where they would help slaves escape, they wanted this at the end. And so Congress passed the 1850 this Fugitive Slave Act. But many people were morally opposed to this for religious reasons or whatever it may be. And many people directly fought against it, as I mentioned with the Underground Railroad. And this caused again more division as things continue to crop up. And another glaring issue that was going on at this time is that a black person who was a slave, and if they tried to challenge their status as so basically another issue that came up during 1850 with this law specifically was that if a black person was in the North and someone did want to follow the law and return a slave back to a runaway slave, well, they wouldn't always know that a person was a slave, but they might assume they were. So they would pick them up, take them to court. But the issue was that a black person, even if they were free or not free, didn't really matter. They couldn't represent themselves in court. They just weren't able to. They weren't recognized as a person in court. And so therefore, most times than not, they would just be counted as a slave and then sent back to some plantation anyway. So this law was just already rigged against black people from the start for those very reasons, because even though some black people were free and not slaves, they would become slaves because people would pick them up and just think they're slaves and they wouldn't have any representation. So things were not good. And then in 1857, you have another big event that occurs before the Civil War, which is the Dred Scott case. So this leads to the infamous case of Dred Scott. And Dred Scott was taken to a free state in the North, and he challenged that upon entering a free state that he is now a free man. So Dred Scott said, well, I'm in a free state now. I should be considered a person because this state doesn't allow slavery. Slavery's outlawed here. But the court decided that Dred Scott didn't have the right to raise a challenge regarding his status because as a black person, he didn't have that right. Chief Justice Roger B. Taney stated that no black person, free or enslaved, could petition the court because they were not citizens within the meaning of the Constitution. So therefore, the court said that Dred Scott couldn't raise his complaint, or he couldn't challenge his freedom because the Constitution didn't recognize him as a person. He was just property. This caused an uproar, especially among your abolitionists, people who wanted to ban slavery, especially among your people who were morally opposed to slavery. This raised a lot of uproar in the North, a lot. And people in the South were happy about this, but this would cause then their slaves also, if they found out, to be upset. So then this obviously, everything's starting to mount up, and the South got tired of it, and they started to break away from the Union. So, thanks to several causes, Civil War broke out. The South was afraid that they were going to lose their slavery, which gave them their economic advantage and gave them their political strength. And they were afraid that the federal government was overstepping its bounds in the states, and that the states in the North and the new free states in the West would become more powerful. And they feared that this Western expansion wouldn't favor them politically. They thought they would lose representation, lose their slaves, lose their money, lose their power, and lose everything that made the South economically effective. So they started to secede from the North. And so then you had the bloody Civil War that lasted for a few years, killing the most Americans in any war ever. And during this war, you had in 1862, you had the Emancipation Proclamation, where Lincoln states that if all slaves in the South are free, if the rebelling states don't stop rebelling. Well, they didn't stop rebelling, so He didn't really have any power to enforce this except by winning the war, but he made it clear that his intentions were to abolish slavery in the rebelling states. And it's important to note that this was only applicable to states that were rebelling. But he did say during the Emancipation Proclamation that if they win this war, or if the southern states don't give up their rebellion, they're going to lose their slaves after the North takes over, which then did happen following the end of the Civil War. And then you had the 13th Amendment that was passed in 1865 at the end of the war that abolished slavery in all states. That was not just to rebelling states. And in 1868 and 1870, you had the 14th and 15th Amendment that passed, giving black men the right to vote. This would not include women until the 1900s, but black men were now able to vote in 1860 by 1868, 1870. By 1870, black people were now able to vote. Although this would eventually lead to more issues when we get to the civil rights movement. So as of now, what I just want to do, I'm going to continue on to the civil rights movement next. But in theory, at this point, you would think that, okay, slavery was abolished across all states. Black men were given the right to vote. This should have ended the issue. But the problem is that, as we said in 1619, when the first black people arrived to the states, they were automatically made slaves. And then you had a bunch of laws that were put in place to make sure they stayed slaves. And then you had black people being associated with slavery. You had black people being associated with the lower class. You had black people being associated as weaker, not as smart, not as good people, and they were just referred to as property. And then the courts didn't recognize them. The government didn't recognize them as people. They had no freedoms or rights. Black people had very little, they had no advantage in society. They were the lowest of the lows in a lot of ways. And this mindset was ingrained in many Americans. Now, obviously, you had abolitionists and other people who fought against slavery, who fought against racism, who didn't agree with this, and they were trying to end it. And that's why we are where we are today, why things are better today than they were then. But people's minds don't just change because the laws change. People's minds takes time to change, and so that's what leads us into the next section, which is the civil rights movement. So in theory, things should have ended, but since people don't change overnight, and since prejudices will remain for generations to come, it takes time to break down those prejudices as the new generations come in and have different mindsets and different views on things like racism or race. So following the 15th Amendment, you had southern states starting to implement different laws that would eventually be called Jim Crow laws, which were explicitly preventing black people from being able to thrive in the U.S. You had things like literacy tests at voting booths. You had things you had sharecropping, which was basically just ripping off black people most times and not. You had you had segregation and other laws that were just called Jim Crow laws that were supposed to prevent black people from being as successful as white people. And so a famous case that arose following these Jim Crow laws being established was the Plessy versus Ferguson case in 1896. And again, this was not a great ruling. This was an awful ruling where the court declared that separate but equal. So Jim Crow segregated black people from white people. Black people couldn't go to the same bathrooms as white people. They couldn't ride on the same buses, stuff like that. And obviously the things that black people the places that ended up being designated for black people were always less funded, weren't as clean, weren't as nice. But Plessy versus Ferguson said, well, I mean, you might be segregated from society. You might be separated, but you're still equal. You're still now able to vote. So just suck it up, Buttercup, was basically what the court said. And obviously, that's terrible mindset that would lead then to what we would have later on in the 1900s with Martin Luther King Jr. and stuff like that. So again, the courts still aren't recognizing black people as completely equal with white people, and there's still a lot of racism within the government and a lot of racism within the culture, especially within former slave states. So then you get to the mid 1900s as black people continue to raise their voices, as the movement continues on, as abolitionists and anti-racists and whatever you want to call them started fighting more and more for the rights of black people. You had kind of the really big push for the civil rights movement. What really got things started eventually. I mean, you had wait, actually I'm jumping ahead of the gun here a little bit. right before the big push, which is Rosa Parks. We'll get to that. In 1948, actually, it's interesting to note that Harry Truman passed an executive order 9981, which helped eliminate discrimination in the military, because following the World Wars, a lot of black people helped join the army and fight for the wars, and a lot of black people were like, "We fought for this country, we helped protect it, but yet there's segregation in the military. We got to be one unit to fight war." And so Harry Truman passed the executive order that we got to end discrimination within the military. Black and white people need to be able to work together for the good of the country. And so that was a start of really big legal change within the government. But then you have the civil rights movement that got a good push start with Rosa Parks. So Rosa Parks in 1955 refused to give up a seat to a white person, and she refused to go to the black section of the bus, which then she got kicked off and arrested and things like that. So this started the bus boycott, which was the real big push and kickstart for the civil rights movement in the 1950s and 1960s era. You had Martin Luther King Jr., who became kind of the leader of this movement, and he started to head up a lot of marches, a lot of protests, and a lot of these things. And this is when we would start getting some big cases to turn in favor for black people. So you had Brown versus Board of Education in 1954 that made it illegal for public schools to segregate. They overturned Plessy versus Ferguson and that ruling. You had the Civil Rights Act of 1957, which made it easier for easier for black people to vote, and made it wrong, like made literacy tests wrong, or you shouldn't be able to use them. Obviously, this wouldn't end people still practicing these type of things. You have the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which guaranteed equal pay and voting easier for black people and helped integrate more public squares, helping further dismantle Jim Crow laws, which would eventually happen in 1965 with the Voting Rights Act after the Selma event. So, as I've listed off, in the 1950s, there's a big after 1950s, after the World Wars, really, there's a lot of big societal change in favor of black people, governmentally speaking. A lot of laws were passed. A lot of people were fighting for the rights of black people, and you had these big civil rights movements which were helping make it easier for black people to succeed. And following the bloody Selma event, where a bunch of police beat and harmed peaceful protesters in Alabama, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 basically eliminated any type of discrimination when it came to voting. And then you had the Fair Housing Act of 1968, which federally mandated that housing be provided without discrimination, helping bring an end to redlining, which is where if a black person owned property, it automatically became less valuable. Or if a black person moved into a certain neighborhood, it was all the houses in that neighborhood become less valuable. That was made illegal, and you couldn't just upcharge someone because they were black. And that was kind of the last major reform within the government. There's other reforms that would come, other things, but these are like the most major ones at the federal level that changed the dynamic of how black people would be integrated into American society. And so why do I go through that? Why do I go through all those different events, and why did I bring out just to show all this? One, I wanted to make it clear that when we talk about critical race theory, that we are talking about something that at least was an issue in America. Now, is racism still systematic? Is there still systematic racism? Maybe. We'll look at that. We'll take a look at that. But it was definitely an issue for centuries. And as we can tell, as I established in the middle there with the whole slavery ending and all that, in theory that should have ended racism, but it didn't. Racism continued on. And so we shouldn't be surprised that at the very least, there's still going to be racist things happening following all these legal changes that I spouted off here in the 60s and 50s era. Just because laws are now in place that black people cannot be discriminated against in the military, in the workforce and stuff like that, doesn't mean it doesn't happen. It doesn't mean that people aren't fighting against them, or doesn't mean that there isn't racism still going on, because people's mind don't change overnight. People's mind don't change just because the laws change. People's minds change with time, with reasoning, with cultural changes, and as new generations come in with their with different beliefs or different morals or different perspectives, that's how things change. So we shouldn't be surprised that there's still tension to this day, even though it might be like 50 years ago. that these type of things were happening. 50 years is still not a lot of time in regard to how people change their minds. But I just wanted to demonstrate that this was a big issue, and there's still a lot of people alive today who experience how hardcore racism growing up, who still experience a lot of these pains, and they still deal with PTSD and stuff like that. This is still an issue that we need to take seriously and at least look at it from a historical perspective and put within context CRT. I know it's a hot button issue. I know there's a lot of things to say about it, and we'll get into all that. But I just wanted to give context to what we're talking about. This has been an issue for a while, and we shouldn't just think that because laws now are different that there aren't still issues or that people still won't have issue with things today. So I just wanted to establish some context for what we'll be talking about and understand the severity of it, but also to understand that there has been change. So there's people who also say, well, racism is worse now than it was 100 years ago. I don't think that really makes sense either. But anyway, I just wanted to establish some context. I wanted to give us a background, and I wanted just to have us keep that in mind as we move forward talking about CRT. So yeah. Now, next episode, we'll talk a little bit more about CRT and the actual roots of CRT. So what does CRT actually state? What's the definition of it? And how did it actually get started as an intellectual practice and its response to racism in the Americas? So we'll be talking about that next episode. So if that sounds interesting to you, definitely, again, subscribe and check it out. And you can follow me on Instagram and Twitter, and check me out at ltworld.info. And now, please, friends, go out there and light the world.